is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal Podcast, I'm happy to welcome Lance Hillsinger to the Cameron Journal Podcast. He is a child social worker and has written a couple books on the welfare system and child protective services and all that sort of thing. This is a topic that is never talked about enough. And this is a topic that I think is, it's overlooked, under-examined, and it's important to get a real kind of on-the-ground report about these systems and how we can improve upon them, because no system is probably more important than this one, long-term. And if you get it wrong, it can cause a lot of costs and all this sort of thing. So we won't get into that now. Enough about me. Welcome, Lance, to the Cameron Journal Podcast. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me.
Good. So let's dive straight in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and then we'll get specific.
Well, I was a child welfare social worker for 34 years, the first 5 in Los Angeles County, and the last 29 years with San Luis Obispo County. And San Luis Obispo County is about 90 minutes north of Santa Barbara. It's the county immediately north of Santa Barbara. And in that work, I did almost all court cases, except for the first year when I was what they call an emergency response worker, being the first social worker to go out to investigate. And I thoroughly enjoyed the work. It was, of course, challenging at times, difficult, and some. My book talks about some of the challenges that may not be obvious at first. And I felt like the system has generally improved. It's gotten better. It was very chaotic when I first joined. And there's been various changes in regulations and laws that has made the system better, but not better completely. As a point of my first book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services, social workers are becoming much more bureaucrats and having to be paper pushes, and the paperwork end, like in so many jobs, is getting quite overwhelming. And then, of course, in child welfare cases, like I said, I handled court cases. Vast majority of times, parents were poor enough to qualify for a court-appointed attorney. So in very rough times, you could say that 4/5 of the cases in child welfare that where the child's placed out of the home come from the poorest 1/5 of society. And what can we do? What can we do about that as all this, we had the war on poverty that started in the 60s. Where are those programs today? And so I followed up my first book with a second book called Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century. And it examines the social welfare programs, how they could be made better, how they have improved, just like child welfare system has improved some. There's been improvements in the social welfare system, but there could still be more improvements. But also to show how those programs can only do so much, and that we need capitalism can either create wealth, or bad capitalism can close a factory and people are out of work, and you lay off 1,000 people, a certain percentage of them are going to, drown their sorrows in alcohol or drugs or get violent because they've lost their jobs. And so there's a real society benefits when there's a downturn in the economy. And so that's what I want to do is what can we do to basically help America become a better place for everyone. So not just people with foster children, but to increase it for everyone and make it a better place. And so I have various suggestions, large and small, in my second book.
Excellent. Well, that's a tour de force. Let's. I think I'd like to particularly talk about your ideas on social policy and what happens to poor people in the Child Protective Services system. That's an area where, when I was researching education, I found out we don't have an education problem in this country. We have a socioeconomic problem. And if you were able to offer the same support to children in poorer school districts as the ones in wealthy districts get, I dare say the entire country would be made better for it. In terms of the kind of impact of child protective services in poor families, do you view it purely as a socioeconomic problem, or is it a cultural problem or a survival issue? What do you think's the root there?
Well, I don't think there's any one answer there. One of the things that I stress in my book is that the court system needs to look at people individually. And in child welfare, there can be all sorts of different cases. The child maltreatment can come in various different forms, but roughly 2/3 of the cases have to deal with substance abuse, drug abuse, or alcohol abuse that leads to neglect. They might be also domestic violence, there might be also mental health issues. There might also be the absent father because he's incarcerated for something totally unrelated. And that's one of the things that I think that we need to do is help make better fathers, to have them more actively. So often I had cases where it was the single mom and maybe her new boyfriend, and the father was minimally involved with the children, maybe partly because of economics, because he's barely making do. He's not paying child support because he doesn't have a lot of income to begin with. So there's not any one solution here, but I do think that people still have responsibility. The vast majority of poor people do not have severe substance abuse problems that necessitate their children being removed. So there is some personal responsibility. We can't ignore that. And two people that are both in, say, disadvantaged situations, one person succeeds and another person makes bad choices, there's some responsibility to that person making bad choices. What you want to do is coax the system in such a way that fewer people make fewer bad choices.
No, that is true. I'm working on a new political theory called individual collectivism, and one of my main points is that if we think about things systemically and we create systems that incentivize the type of behavior that's positive for both people at an individual level and for society, it makes it incredibly easy. If you make it easy for people to do it, they'll do it. If you make it hard and put up a lot of barriers, far fewer people will do it. Pretty simple and intuitive, but people seem to not understand that.
I think we take a very sometimes, punitive look to the world, and you must pay your taxes, you must do this, you must support your children, and if you do it, we're going to send child support after you and do these things. Like what I talk about in my second book is that what can we do to encourage fathers to be more diligent in paying support? And one of the things I propose is that they complete a parenting class, and that they get, for completing the parenting class, you get 5% off your child support. That would give them an incentive to be more active. And the mother, assuming most of the time, 90% of the time, it's the mother that has custody. That would give her some better faith that when the children are in his care, they're taken care of. And we give her a chance to get a break and whatever. And, everybody, the most loving parent still needs a break once in a while from their children. And so that's one of the things about incentives. And I think that you can talk about carrots and sticks. Of course, the combination is best if you use both. But I think too often the system says sticks when maybe we should have incentives.
Yes. Yes. And to that point, I wanted to find out, a lot of parents live in a certain modicum of fear of child protective services. There are so many horror stories. Um, should people be living in fear of CPS? Can we unpack that? Can you give us some insight as to that cultural idea?
Well, I acknowledge that because I think most people would prefer to hear from the IRS than CPS, is how I used to joke. Um, I think that most of the time, professionals, social workers are professionals. They go about their job. They do have to investigate things when somebody says something's amiss in the home. They do have to go about their job, just like the police. I think the vast majority of the time, the police do their job, even though there's a lot of attention when they don't. And when social workers don't do their job or do their job excessively, there's attention to it. But the most of the time, it's certainly something not a parent would want to undergo, but I think that they should have belief that the person is just doing their job at the best that they want, and that some of the questions that a social worker might ask are based on their experience, that they don't have a crystal ball that understands your home. For instance, I could think
yes, no, of course. I'm so sorry. You stopped and was waiting for a question.
No,
I thought you were going to continue. It's okay. Yes, no, I think I get that. I get that. I just feel like there's this sort of like, I think you're right. People would rather deal with the IRS than CPS, and it seems like. I mean, I think you're right. The cases we hear about are the ones that go wrong. We don't hear about the ones that go right because they went right. What's the story? There isn't one. However, it does seem like I sometimes wonder with CPS whose interests they are serving.
Well, I think the social workers want to say that they're serving the best interests of the child. I think that most people go about their job taking pride, like whatever one's job occupation happens to be. Most people have pride in their job. And so I think the vast majority of social workers are good about that. And they don't have an attitude towards the clients. A lot of people that my social worker hates me or whatever. That's not it. The social worker may be frustrated about the job because of low pay or a bad shift or a bad supervisor or other things that people are. But as far as the clients, that's usually for after you're in the while, doing this a while, the clients are who they are. And you accept that that's part of the social contract of being a social worker, that you sometimes will deal with difficult people, and that you sometimes will deal with people who may have a hostile idea towards government. And part of the social worker skill is to disarm that. And I think a lot of times that good social workers can overcome that relatively quickly.
Definitely. That is certainly true. So when it comes to your improvements in social policy and perhaps the successes and or failures of the war on poverty and all this type of thing, what are a handful of things from your perspective we could do to improve the material conditions of most Americans?
Well, let me just stay we'll talk about war on poverty. Let me talk about one of the programs of war on poverty is welfare, cash aid to poor people. And one of the things that happens if the father's out of the home, which is the majority of the time, he's usually not making good money. If he was making good money, the mother would get child support. So he's a marginal employee as far as the dollars that he earns. And if child support is taken from him, it doesn't go to the mother. It goes back to the government to offset the cost of welfare. Now that sounds rational. That sounds very rational. Okay, the government is supporting the child, and we can collect some money here from the father. So let's just kind of cut the deficit a little bit in what it's cost. But what that does is that doesn't give. You talk about incentives. That doesn't give the incentive to the father to do it above toward a regular, what I call W-2 wage job. If he knows he's going to be hit with child support and it doesn't go to his kids, but goes to the government, he's more inclined to take a cash job or maybe an illegal job. So that's a disincentive. And if the mother were to get an extra $100, $150, because the father's not making that much, because otherwise the mother would be getting child support, not cash aid, that can really make a difference. An extra $100, $200 a month for somebody making $50,000 a year is nice. Somebody on welfare, an extra $102 a month is a real change in how you're living and the security that you have. And that minor change. And also, if the mother knows that the father is paying support of she's getting money from him, she's going to have a little better attitude towards him. And he will have, they're more likely to have a better relationship with his kids. And that will make for healthier children. So even though the government will lose a little money on the upfront, not collecting it, the long term is a much greater, much better child, a child living a little bit better, not so much in poverty, and somebody who's in the mainstream of society, or more likely to be in the mainstream economy. So that's
certainly I can see that. Yes, that's it's an interesting sort of a perspective on cash payment. Anything else that we could be doing?
Well, the other thing is that since the food stamp program is based upon the size of the family and income, that makes sense, right? Okay, you've got very little income, a large family, you're going to get more than a family with some income and just a two-person family. Well, teenage boys are hungry, as any parent will tell you. Teenagers in general, but especially teenage boys. It shouldn't be too hard to adjust the state computers that issue the food stamps to allocate extra money if there's teenagers in the home. Again, this is the one thing that is fairly simple, that is going to be cost effective in the long run. You're not going to have people running to the food bank having that sense of desperation. That sense of desperation, if you don't know that your food's going to last till the end of the month, that causes that's an emotional stress. If you have a job, you can't be as good as employee because in the back of your mind you're worried, is the cupboard going to be full at the end of the month? And if you have assurance there, enough money coming in to keep your teenagers fed, then you're going to be an emotionally healthy person, better able to take any kind of job training or education, or just be a better employee. So that would be one change system that I would improve upon, is that there be allocation for a supplement if there's teenagers in the home.
No, that makes very practical sense. Very, very practical sense, because teenagers will eat you out of house and home for sure. That is a thing. Excellent. Now,
yes. Just one little side to that is most juvenile crime, most adult criminals had some sort of delinquency as a child. It tends to be, and most of that is by teenage boys. Mm-hmm. If you give the teenage boy an incentive to be home because he's not out at his friend's house where there's food, or his buddy's house, or out doing things, he's going to be home. So there could even be conceivably a reduction in teenage delinquency. So that would be a bonus to that. And they'll get well worth the money, because I know everybody's worried about cost.
Yes. Well, I don't think people realize that that by every metric, the SNAP food stamp program is actually the most efficient federal program. It has the least amount of fraud. It beats out Medicare in terms of that. Like, it is like, and the good that it does is huge. When states cut back on food stamps, the profits of stores like Walmart and Dollar General go down measurably. Like, it affects the markets, because most of the money that goes into that program goes right into people's pockets. I mean, it's really a model for the rest of the federal government. Some other departments should take notes from what they're doing down at the food stamp office.
Right. And an interesting thing, in some states, if you're a convicted felon, even if you're discharged off parole, there's a lifetime ban on food stamps. And that's not good. That just triggers an incentivized person to make do by committing crime. So I would say that if you're discharged and you're otherwise financially qualified and you're on parole, you still should be able to get food stamps, because that's going to help you maintain a lawful lifestyle. So it's, again, money.
Right.
That's a little bit, penny saved here is a pounder, and later down the road. And the states that are taking the punitive approach, you committed a crime 30 years ago, because some have lifetime bans. We're going to
Right.
still not let you if you've fallen on hard times for you and your children you have food stamps.
Right. It's like you committed a crime in 1992, so no food stamps for you in 2022. Um, yeah. So no, that is that is a good idea. And also, I mean, it also, speaking of money ahead, I don't think people underestimate how much it costs for our mass incarceration problem. It's very expensive. It's not cheap. Like keeping that many humans locked up in buildings is not an inexpensive thing. And if we could reduce the recidivism rate, we would actually come out money ahead.
That's absolutely correct. It's approximately $40,000 a year, a little bit lower in some states, higher in other states, a little bit more in the federal prison system. But a ballpark figure is $40,000 a year, and every dollar spent in the prison system is one less dollar spent for the university systems. And having to put two through college, I would have liked to have seen a few more dollars put in the education system and tuition a little bit lower.
Yes, no, certainly. And also just the economic benefit of if people are out and about and able to get housing and get jobs, as my Nana says, I don't understand. If people are out and working and having jobs, they pay taxes and it makes the system better. This isn't rocket science, like, but it seems like there are so many people that are kind of like, oh, well, you're poor, you're brown, you committed some sort of crime, you're now exiled from society for forever. And we have this system that, sidelines people. And that I see as a net negative. I've seen too many stories of it. There's a guest I had on this show named Dutch Simmons, and he is a federal felon. And on Twitter, he's always talking about the various and sundry ways like his crimes come back to haunt him or screw him over or whatever have you. I have another friend who was arrested on a minor weed charge a dozen years ago. And like, and which in his state, Tennessee, is a felony. And so how the system is always kind of just locking these guys out of any sort of way to advance their life or whatever have you. And I can't but help but notice that this ends up being a net negative. And it is no wonder that once you become part of the system, it's incredibly difficult to get out.
Yeah, you're quite right. I had a friend of mine who was, I don't want to say, he was in the education system and he wanted to retire and go to Canada, but he had a DUI when he was a young man, and Canada wouldn't let him immigrate because of a DUI he had 30 years ago. But one of the things I want to point out is that maybe in olden days, you could hide something like that. You could hide a record and lie on your employment application and say, no, I don't have a felony or I don't have a record. And maybe your employer sees you come to work every day and work hard, and you're okay. I don't care what the person's past was. I'm not going to go check. Now, even for most jobs, there's a record check. And you can't hide from a criminal record anymore because it's all digitized. And so that's been a change too, that it sticks with you more now if you get into trouble.
Yes. And I don't think people understand that, like, especially, with, everything, not only employment, but housing, all sorts of things make it it makes it incredibly difficult to literally function in society. I met this guy in this hotel in Billings, Montana, and we sat for a few hours and he told me his story and, getting out of jail and how he's like, the only reason I didn't end up back in jail is because I happened to get this job working at the front desk of a hotel, make enough money, all this type of thing. And he's like, it was one of the female guards that gave me money to get the basics so I could even get a job, because there's nothing for you afterwards. And I feel like that ends up, I feel like there's this nexus of like bad education, poverty, crime, prison system. And we talk about school to prison pipeline, but this is like the three-legged stool of like social problems that just metastasize out into so many other things that you wouldn't think would be connected to them, but are often intrinsically connected. And there's so many people that, a small intervention, a better teacher, a better school, whatever have you, could have completely changed their life. And as a society, we just don't seem to care. Has that been your observation? Because I feel like small interventions could make a big deal in a lot of people's lives, and we just don't care.
Well, I think everyone needs someone to care. As you were talking, I want to stress about positive things that are done. And I learned that as a social worker that for people who were coming off parole, they would have to go to this mandatory meeting soon after being discharged. And at this mandatory meeting, they would be seated at the front. And every conceivable agency, Drug and Alcohol Services, Housing Agency, the Veterans Affairs, unemployment, rehabilitation, any conceivable government agency that could help somebody. And they would be told to stand up and turn around and look, these people are here to help you to succeed. And I've heard that, how powerful that was to so many people in my caseload, these moments, that I hope that other communities do that they gather all the people, all the agencies together and say, yes, let's work together and let's first know that there's a team out there, that there are agencies. Now, the other thing is I don't want to oversell things. And the housing is certainly a difficulty. And it's one of the points I make in my book is it's getting more and more expensive for even middle-class people. My children's generation don't see themselves as eventual homeowners because the price has gone up so much more than the wages. I think one of the ways to counteract that is to levy a surcharge for non-owner occupied housing. In other words, so the big corporations don't buy up housing and then rent it out, that they have to pay 5% surcharge and that money go to homeless programs so that we have people living in their own homes that they own, that they will pay off eventually, and that their children will inherit the equity. Because I think the home ownership rate is declining because home values are increasing so much. And that's one of the things that we have to do. I think one of the points I made in my second book is the GI Bill, which of course helps people veterans get housing, was one of the best anti-poverty programs out there. It's not thought of an anti-poverty program, but it is an effective anti-poverty program.
No, certainly. And that's, I'm a big advocate for bringing back public housing. People are kind of like, oh, well, the last time we tried that, it failed miserably. I'm like, no, it didn't. It failed because the federal government gave up and quit funding it. That's it. Like the rents from the apartments couldn't cover the maintenance on the big expensive buildings the federal government had built. If we funded it, if we had a permanent public housing program that was well funded and kept up, public housing would work. That's literally all it takes.
Well, I think that most of public housing now, or public financed housing, is Section 8, where the renter pays usually a quarter of the rent and then the federal government picks up the other 3/4. I think that's a better system because concentrating all the wealth into a large complex is sort of a magnet for crime. And if you have people in regular housing and the government is just financing it, that's a solution. That's a better solution. But one of the things happened in San Luis Obispo, where rents are extremely high, is that people couldn't even afford the 1/4 share of the rent.
No, I mean, so I have a property management background, and I know the Section 8 program really well, and I worked for a landlord association, and I had to walk our clients through, why taking Section 8 isn't a bad idea and all this type of thing. And there was a lot of people who were very reticent about it. I mean, I don't know where you are with this, but I'm of the mind, like, yeah, let's build, Soviet style apartment blocks and have people lived it. Like, no, like bring back Cabrini Green and Pruitt-Igoe and all those. I mean, that wasn't a bad idea. It was just poorly funded and executed, and I think I feel like trying to keep the housing problem, in the private market and just paying for it without providing like actual homes for people, one ends up being a handout to landlords, which we can have a conversation if that's a good idea or not. And two, I also feel like it creates an additional barrier. Whereas I feel like if you have people who are having housing access troubles or are transitioning out of the system or whatever have you, and you see this with housing first programs, in my mind, wouldn't it just be easier? Get rid of Section 8 and the wait lists because they're years long. Screw all that. Let's just give people apartments. Like, let's just build giant apartment blocks and give them housing.
Yeah, then something like 4 million units are needed to be built. And one of the things I point out in the book is like Habitat for Humanity. Nice organization. Jimmy Carter, you're off building houses. People have to contribute some labor to that. But that doesn't create a lot of homes very quickly. They usually build a couple of homes at a time, and having volunteer labor, the volunteers have to be trained. There's a lot of bureaucracy, as you said. There's a lot of impediments, a lot of screening process and things like that. Why not just incentivize building companies to, if they build a housing, let them have if they assign 20% of their units in a 100-unit apartment complex as Section 8, designate that, then they can have any profits from that could be tax-free from those units. So you need to put the money into the system. The other thing is that for people to work, to go in a little bit different mood here, of course, people need to have jobs in order to be able to afford housing. And that usually often means childcare. Childcare can be very, very expensive. As I joke, when my kids were young, and this is when I saw an ad for a Mercedes Benz, and it says, you could lease a Mercedes Benz for such and such. And I turned to my wife and I said, honey, we could lease 2 Mercedes and have money left over for what we're paying in childcare. How do we get more childcare providers?
Yeah.
And there's been a decline. In roughly the last 20 years, the family daycare provider, the kids that are age newborn to say 4, that are typically done in someone's homes, that's declined by about 1/3. And you could say, okay, we'll fund it more, but if there's not the homes, the funding won't do you any good. So again, let's do a financial incentive. Let's say if you're a daycare provider, the first $15,000 you earn is tax-free. That would be enough to maybe trigger more people to do it and reward people. And I work it out in my book. If so many thousands, it would only be like $440,000, $440 million if you increased it by so many people. I forgot how many people it is. But then because of that daycare, you've got somebody working, that person's working, they're paying taxes. You almost have a wash.
Yes. Well, and I think not only that, but in my mind, the fact that we don't have universal childcare in this country is probably the biggest crime, especially for the working class.
Yeah.
And there have been so many runs at that. People forget Hillary Clinton was one of the first people to try to get that done. Elizabeth Warren has been talking about it for 10 years, all this type of thing. They tried to do it this time with Build Back Better, didn't make it. But to me, it's like that would be the economic benefit of that would outweigh whatever it cost, which actually, by the way, isn't that much. Universal childcare is actually pretty inexpensive as the government programs go.
As government programs go, if you look at Head Start, it's about $10,000 per child.
I'm just saying the Pentagon lost $1.1 trillion over the last 10 years, and we could buy a lot of universal childcare with just DOD's couch change.
Yeah, there's a point there. You're absolutely right.
No, I mean, people talk about like, oh, these social programs are always so expensive. I said, universal childcare is less than $100 billion. Over at the Pentagon, that's lunch. That's an accounting error. Over at the Pentagon, like these programs, they have such a high impact for what they cost. And yeah,
when I was a social worker, there was just like Head Start was like it was like trying to find an apartment. There was no vacancies. It was very, very frustrating for people who were turning their lives around. They were doing their programs, but they still needed childcare in order to do it. And even with siblings, because usually you have priority if you have one sibling in a school or one sibling in a Head Start, you have a little priority because you want to keep kids together. Even with that, the waiting list was months long, and that you're right. Your money is money well spent. That kind of thing. And just to give you another, for instance, in the tone that you're taking, one of the things I talk about in my book is that toddlers coming into foster care often have very bad teeth. That's one. It's not that. And very often dental surgery is needed to correct those teeth, even under the age of 5, because there's been neglect because the mother's usually been involved with drugs. But one of the points I make in my book is that there was only one dental clinic for many years in San Luis Obispo County. And then we had 3. And the number of times that I had to ask a judge for a court order for dental surgery for a child dropped by at least half when we had more dental clinics. And so in the sense that, of course, not every child there, that helped by having the services available. But if you're in one part of the county and and you don't have a car, and the only dental clinic for your kids on the other side of the county, it's just not going to happen.
Right.
So, but one of the things I want to point out is that it's not just a problem about money. One of the themes in my book is dads, and we need to get dads to be more successful, fathers to be more successful, and the dropout rate for boys is much higher than girls. A white girl has a much higher chance of graduating high school than a black boy. And what are we going to do? And one of the things that I think is very simple is you just say that school districts that get federal funding, which is virtually all of them, that you have to publish on your website graduation rates broken down by gender. The first thing to solve a problem is to identify a problem. If you say, okay, our dropout rate for girls is 5%, our dropout rate for boys is 12%, then the school district has the problem put in front of their face, and the solution will be different. The solution will be different in Florida than it will be in Georgia, than South Dakota, and Los Angeles. But at least you've identified that, and you've made it an issue without costing any money. It doesn't cost any money to say, hey, show your graduation rate broken down by gender. And because in some cities like Los Angeles and New York, the graduation rate is only like 75%. So the dropout rate is 25%, however you want to put it. And that's atrocious. You talk about people with a criminal record. A boy who fails to graduate high school is going to drift into criminality. He's at risk to dropping into criminality. He's going to be a risk for public safety. A girl who drops out of high school, she may wind up getting pregnant. She may be an economic burden on the taxpayer, but she's not generally, over statistically, a threat to public safety. Now, of course, there's exceptions, but I mean, broad generally. And so I think we need to identify what's keeping boys from not graduating in high school.
Well, yes. I've always been of the opinion, I think there's 2 problems. One, the education system tends to treat boys like defective girls, which isn't helpful. And the other, which is people get mad when people say that, and people get mad when I say that, but it's true. And it's funny because I've had teachers, especially teachers who have sons, admit it, but people still get mad about it. So it's like anti-feminist or something. I think that's the first problem. I think the second problem is we have kids in high school for too long. We put everybody on the college track when the reality is the vast majority will never go to college. I say, yes, do as the British very wisely do. Stop high school at 16 and get people out into the workforce. Take those last 2 years and get them out into the workforce or community college learning a trade, something. That way they leave high school with a skill that makes money. This doesn't seem like rocket science to me, but when you try to suggest this, people get verklempt about the whole thing.
Yeah, you're right. I think vocational training is something. I know that they do that in Germany too. That even if you're on a college-bound track, you're supposed to take some vocational training along the way. And
Yeah.
I think that's a good. And as far as the school system is, while of course there's many boys who like fiction, most boys do not really like. We teach English as literature. And is that really successful? I mean, English as literature is good for answering questions on Jeopardy or becoming a playwright or a screenwriter or an English teacher, but it's not really a useful skill. A useful skill would be how to write a report. And so instead of teaching kids about character development or poetry or what's a quatrain, I may not even have that right, that you teach them, hey, watch this thing on video and pretend you're a police officer, write a report on that. And then they say, oh, okay, okay, this has happened. And practice writing nonfiction. And I think we need to add, again, this is something that doesn't cost any money. We need to make a year of English be at least a year of be nonfiction. You can take journalism and debate as electives, but most kids are not going to do that. Most kids need to learn how to write a letter, complaining about the product or whatever. And that we don't teach nonfiction writing. And that is writing that boys tend to gravitate to. And the teachers told me that. If the boys will tend to gravitate to books about sports or something that is an actual event. And of course, there's exceptions, but the general rule is that they don't read fiction.
Yes, I've as someone who is a writer of fiction, and who's talked with, a bunch of different dudes and all this type of thing. Like I've had so many dudes be kind of like, oh God, they made me read Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet and all this type of thing, or Sense and Sensibility. And it was just so awful and so boring and so terrible. And which in my mind, I'm just kind of like, I don't understand, but I've heard that as well, especially from my STEM minded friends who are all engineers and computer science people and all this type of thing. I think they would rather read a book on the history of Python or, some computer programming code than they would Jane Eyre. So, yeah.
And I think there's an interesting thing to put on that. Of fictional book sales, 80% are purchased by women. So I think there is that corollary there that this is a gender issue. And yes, you're the exception that likes that fictional stuff. But you're right. I was more of the STEM kind of guy. And I would find reading The Great Gatsby just absolutely boring. I don't care about these people. They're all pretend anyways.
Right.
So there's things that we can do in society that can make things better. We can incentivize dads to pay child support. We can incentivize people to become daycare providers. We can use the carrot and say, okay, if you're a corporation, you're buying housing and it's pricing everybody else out of the market, well, you got to pay a little penalty. You got to pay a little carrot for that.
And I think the most important thing is creating systems that incentivize people to be able to function in society. That's, I think, in my mind, that's very important. Reducing the barriers, because if you put up too many barriers, people just won't do it.
One of the things that barriers is a buzzword in social services. And people ask me, what's this barrier to this family succeeding? And I will often say the answer is geography. They are in one part of the county, and the job is in another part of the county, and the buses in San Luis Obispo, this county seat's in the middle of the county, the outlying area. So most of the buses go into the city in the morning, and most of the buses go out of the city out in the afternoon. That makes a lot of sense. But if you're not in that clique, in that mode, that life is hard if you have to depend on public transportation. And geography is often a challenge. For instance, our public housing, we're talking about public housing, one of the public housing units here is about as far away from the high school as you can get. And that certainly makes it a challenge for kids to be in school. And why doesn't the school district for here, there's no bus service for kids in high school. So, kids have to walk a substantial distance. I don't know how many miles it is, and one of my daughter's friends lived in that area, and she was walking at times when it was still dark. That's something that's a real disincentive there. So we need to make sure that people can get where they need to be to succeed. People have personal responsibility, yes, but if you, as I often say, I'm 63. There are 63-year-olds that can run a marathon, but I'm not one of them. So just because some poor person can succeed, some poor person has made it, has broken out of poverty, that doesn't mean everyone can break out of poverty. It means that most people need a helping hand. And I would certainly need a good coach if I was there for run a marathon.
Yes. No, I think that's an apt metaphor for the situation, and very apt for what it takes to make, a real and material difference in people's lives. So, well, we're coming up on the hour. And so I'm so glad that we were able to speak. Why don't you let us know where we can find you and how we can interact with you further?
Well, my website is lancehillsinger.net, and I'd appreciate anyone coming by and dropping a line. I just want to make a shout out here that we talked a lot about geography, and we started off talking about foster parents. If someone is thinking about being a foster parent, there's a created shortage there. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my first book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Service, to inspire people to become foster parents, because it's one of the most rewarding positions. As I borrow a line from the Peace Corps, it's the hardest job you'll ever love. And so we need more of that. We need more. That's one way the system can improve, is more foster parents as far as the child welfare system. And I just, to repeat, my second book, Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century, has all sorts of ideas. Some cost money, some don't cost money, so that we can have have a more successful life, and more people not live in poverty. More people are in poverty today than when the war on poverty started. And we can't, as a society, maintain that. We can't, for each acre devoted to public housing, that's an acre that's not in the private sector. And so we need to get some sort of balance here. And so my book tries to reach that balance.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.